By way of housekeeping, my name is David Potter. I've moderated several of these sessions with the privilege at the MS Group for years. Thank you for joining us today. I feel bad. Those of you over here, I can't see you because the light is right there. So if you have questions, holler them at me. I'm super formal, as you can tell.
And most of the people are in that section right there.
Right here. So yeah.
Feel free, if you want attention, you can come to these center seats right here.
We can't see you over there. The light is right there. Yeah, you're those kids, aren't you? Yeah, okay, we found the bad actors. Yeah, so funny is, as we do on these things, the panelists all get together and we chat, and we found out that every one of us here rides a motorcycle. So by way of introduction, I did mine a little bit. I ride a 2009 Harley-Davidson Ultra Classic. So who are you and what do you ride? That's more important than anything else.
Oh gosh, now that was a loaded one. So I'm Rob Roy. I'm the Chief Technologist for Micro Focus Government Solutions, and I don't currently ride. I've ridden all my life, but I'm thinking about going adventure road biking with either a Honda African Twin or a KTM.
Tony Scott, CEO of Tony Scott Group and former Federal Chief Information Officer. I have multiple of these because I have multiple houses, but Harley V-Rod, so.
My name's Aubrey Merchandise. I'm Federal CTO over at Symantec. I only have one, but it's a KTM 1290 GT.
I'm Jonathan Fibus. I'm the Chief Information Security Officer at the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. Currently, I only have a CBR 600.
So we can talk motorcycles after. Obviously, get us started about talk motorcycles. We'll do that all day. But for this hour, we're going to talk about the federal enterprise and cybersecurity strategies. And this is meant to be just a chat, so we'll bounce stuff back and forth. We will have time at the end for questions. If you have one that's a burning question, feel free. We do want to talk about kind of state of the union, and it's a whole state of the state thing, but strategy is a loaded question, I think. It's a loaded word for a lot of the different agencies, right? They have different missions, different outcomes, different goals. What are you seeing today that is working for effective cyber strategies in the federal government today? And whoever wants to jump in first can take that one first and bounce it around.
So maybe I'll start off and kind of open it up. So I remember a number of years ago when I took a visit to the old executive building to have a discussion with Tony Scott at the time under the last administration. At that time, I was working for Blue Coat Systems, and we were talking about cloud adoption by the federal government and all the benefits that would potentially bring. And quite frankly, it made sense then. It still makes a lot of sense now as far as allowing us to adopt a framework, a strategy that would help us to achieve a big call out in the last executive order on cybersecurity, on strengthening cybersecurity, around getting that consistent baseline across the government and treating it as a single enterprise, which makes absolute sense. So, the government has taken a lot of steps, I think, towards trying to make that a reality, and we do certainly see a lot of adoption, a lot of strategy. I've seen some really interesting strategy coming out of the Pentagon from a DevSecOps standpoint and how they want their future IT infrastructure to manifest itself, and I'm totally on board with it. I just think it's going to take some time to get there, but it's a lot different than we had been sort of pursuing cybersecurity strategy, which is, the whole notion of perimeter defense has absolutely gone out the door. Mm-hmm. And it's going to go out the door even further as we start to adopt cloud technology and containers and microservices and things like that. I think that the future is absolutely very bright, but as far as how quickly we're going to be able to get there, that's another story.
Gotcha. Yeah. John, what are you seeing that's working?
So I would say that CDM has provided a great baseline for everyone to work from. There are still some things that are going to be different from agency to agency, from enterprise to enterprise, but it's got the broad outline of that strategy that the whole government needs to be looking at, and it's starting to get that focus into cloud as well. So even though we have our cloud security access brokers, even though there are a lot of ways to get security implemented in cloud, whether it's infrastructure, platform, or software, we all need to be looking at that same playbook so that we're not making the same mistakes in different ways, and we can all be moving forward to securing that enterprise.
I think, from my perspective, OPM was sort of a watershed moment for the federal government. Mm-hmm. And so what I see different now, particularly on the strategy side, is better governance, number one. So conversations taking place at a much higher level in the organization than was taking place up till that point. Number two, all of the agencies now are required by OMB to risk rate their IT environment on a regular basis and put a priority on where they see cyber risk, and also provide estimates of what it's going to take to fix whatever those things are. So I think that's really different. I certainly had no visibility of any of that stuff coming into the role when I did. And so I think that's important. And then the third thing is, I think, we've been talking about technical debt for a long time, about, replacing old stuff. And I think we're beginning to recognize now that there's something called architecture debt that has to be addressed. So it's not just replacing old stuff with new stuff, but it's the whole design of what we're doing needs to be evaluated. And in light of a bunch of other things that I'm sure we're going to talk about, that architecture, I think, review is something that I see a lot of people starting to really focus on, and I think that's super important.
Ladies and gentlemen, would you please welcome Tony Scott to the stage? Tony taught me something several years ago. He doesn't know it yet, but he's about to find out. So how many of these conferences have you been to where somebody brings up the three letters O, P, and M? Everybody's been to one of those, right? How many of you were affected by the breach that hit O, P, and M? And we talk about it, and it's almost become humorous because it just has to get thrown into every single discussion about cybersecurity in government. Now, after this OPM thing, something happened downtown where there was a review of this cybersecurity incident, and lo and behold, some things happened there that shouldn't have happened, and people like Tony and others have known about these challenges for many, many years before. And Tony created something, and I don't know if it was entirely you or if it was a group.
Always a team.
Always a team, called the Cyber Sprint. And the Cyber Sprint was an action that was taken for the very first time that I've ever seen in government, where roadblocks were removed and government agencies were told that within 30 or 60 days you had to patch everything you knew was vulnerable and implement two-factor authentication and remove privileges from those who didn't need that type of access. And I just saw another session with the artificial intelligence one, and somebody in there had been promoting this from the Center for Internet Security, used to be up at the National Security Agency. And those simple actions that were actually implemented, mandated, and measured very, very quickly, I think, led to a level of safety to where I saw a report about a month ago that came out, I believe, from OMB that stated that in 2018, there were no, quote unquote, major cybersecurity incidents reported in government. Now, as to the definition of major and how many were actually reported last year, there's still quite a bit. We'd all be out of a job if there were none. But I do credit that Cyber Sprint and our ability to fix things rapidly when the need arises. And I just wish we could do more cyber sprints like that across the rest of these security controls to improve the way we're doing things. But we're fine. I believe we're making progress. We're seeing some great progress in government today.
And so that leads, you're a good straight man. So we've done a lot of these panels, right? You've all been on panels before. I've done these for years, commercial and public sector. We always talk about, it's kind of, what works, what doesn't. And so things like that, they're working. We were on the prep calls. I love that architectural debt. I love that, right? I'm going to steal that phrase. It might be a cool band name. But how do we go about improving things like that, right? I mean, what's that process? Because I think what you look at, we've talked for years about the technical debt, we got personnel debt, we're, pick your number, 600,000 people short in the IT industry. So we throw terms like automation, orchestration, all these, as technologists, let's throw technology at the problem and see what works, right? How do you begin to actually affect some of those architectural changes, and what needs to happen for us to be more effective in defending, federal enterprise as well as our own personal information? Who wants to take that one? Where do you start, John?
Well, you start at looking at what's not working and what is the oldest thing I've got, so what's the next to go? And you start building from there. And as we learned over and over again, it seems that every time we replace something, we have to worry about what's going to break. So starting the planning, knowing that something is going to break and trying to plan around that is a wonderful thing. Mm-hmm. A strategy is a great thing to have. It's a long-term plan. But as you start actually getting into the weeds and pulling plugs and throwing things into the ash heap and pulling things out of its new box, you have a great opportunity there to take it a little bit slow, to make sure you're getting it right and that you're building for the long term. So as you're doing it, think, is this service going to be here tomorrow? Probably not. And within the next year and a half, it's going to be up in the cloud, most likely. So am I covered for authentication? Am I covered for patching? Am I covered for data exfiltration? And you start building from there. And that's the only way to do the modernization at the same time as you pay off that debt.
Gotcha. Aubrey?
So I think that I agree with that, and I also think that, kind of looking at where we are as an industry, I would say that, plus we need to think about the data, right? So what is it that we're protecting? Are we consistently categorizing and classifying the elements that we need to perform the mission? Is there the opportunity to reduce or eliminate some of the duplicity or duplicate data so that we have less touch points that we have to monitor and control, right? So if we think about it from the standpoint of, what is the mission? What's the data of the mission? Who are the users, and what data should they have access to? How are we going to allow them to access that data? And any other sort of constraints that we want to put around that data to manage risk. I think we need to take a more holistic view of what that architecture looks like. And frankly, I think that's happening, but to your point, it's going to take time. Mm-hmm. But potentially, we really need to look at, in my opinion, that sort of end state of what would that be, mm-hmm. and for investments that we're going to make from now until we spent $19 billion on cyber this year, just in the federal government. How can we make better use of the investment that we're throwing towards the problem?
Gotcha. We'll skip over to Rob, and we'll let Tony finish with some.
Yeah, and I want to flip this one to Tony, too, to comment. 19 billion on cyber, roughly 80 to 90 billion. I mean, what's a few billion here and there in the overall IT budget? But we're something like on the order of 75% of that is focused on maintaining our legacy systems. And I work for a company now that many of you probably don't even know about, but we're a 50-year-old company, and we call it COBOL 50 right now because the COBOL that we support is now 50 years old. And we're helping organizations now take their mainframe workloads, and miraculously, both Amazon and Microsoft are very interested in helping organizations move those workloads up into the cloud. So part of this is like that modernization, looking at the architectural debt, and kind of we're massively reducing the costs and improving the capabilities that organizations have today. So when you move into the cloud, you get to take advantage in Azure for the Azure AI services on top of whatever type of system and workload that you're bringing into that environment. So there's all kinds of ways to modernize and bring those things up while reducing costs at the same time. But that's part of the when we look at the amount of money that the government spends today in IT and in cybersecurity in general, how do we repurpose those dollars in a way that makes sense for the government?
I guess in answer to the question, I'm a big fan of creating mental models that are easy for people to understand. Because the challenge is multidimensional. It's a technical challenge, it's a management challenge, it's a bunch of different things. But let's talk for a minute about what's changing and kind of what's different. And I think there's a couple of key developments that make all the difference in the world in terms of architecture. One of them is we have machines now that are doing the work that humans used to do in the form of remote process automation, AI, all kinds of different things. And there's many, many more of these, and it's not just a software program or software that runs on a server. It's AI, it's things in containers. There's the spread of these things is everywhere. Our mental models around security, privacy, and so on are around what a person can access. Mm-hmm. And I think that's a fundamental problem when you have software and agents and other things accessing the data. So it's clearly a violation of something if a person accesses the wrong data or by accessing that data violates a law or rule or whatever. But what happens when a machine does it with the same consequences? Well, we don't know what to do with that right now. So I think our technical models as well as our frameworks for how we think about data and decisions and who gets to decide and who's monitoring and all of that need a really strong overhaul. Mm-hmm. So that's where I would start. And I've talked with folks at NIST and others about this new reality that we are all quickly finding ourselves in. And it just feels to me like the old mental models that we have are now in need of replacement in some form or another. Even the notion of privacy in this digital age is something that's just, it's based on really old notions. It's, I have my house and my yard, and if you invade my space, you've invaded my privacy. Or if you search something that I physically protect, mm-hmm. you've invaded my privacy. Well, now in a world where we have cameras everywhere and people are doing all kinds of different stuff, I think we need a new notion of what privacy means in a digital world. And we need to have some really good debates on that in order to form policy and all the rest of it. So I see us focusing on some yesterday kinds of issues when I think the conversation really has to be about, where the ship is headed, and I see it headed in all these challenging directions that the old mental models and frameworks don't address particularly well.
You bring up it's an interesting point, and tie it to Aubrey. So you mentioned risk, right? And I think that's a word that a lot of people, risk is, but I don't know. So a statement into a question, I'll get there, is do we do a good enough job of actually assessing risk in that context, right? You talk about privacy. You want to give people privacy, but there's a risk to having too much privacy, depending on the actor, right? And are we getting so wrapped up? And I kind of know the answer. I'm going to give softball. Are we assigning priority to things that maybe aren't as risky, but there are known patching systems, right? There's a risk there, but overall, are we doing a good enough job assessing and identifying risk factors and then taking action on those things? And we'll start with you on this one, Tony.
I think if it's rear view mirror looking, I think we're doing a much better job. I wouldn't argue perfect, but I think we're doing a much better job. I'm really concerned about those forward things, and I don't see enough conversation about those risks in most places, including private sector boardrooms, by the way, where I'm spending a bunch of time as well. Everybody with GDPR and California consumer privacy and all kinds of other things are starting to focus on, risk-related discussions in their governance model, whatever it happens to be. But it's all pretty rear view mirror facing, Everybody talks about Target or OPM or Sony or, whatever. But those are things that all have already happened. And I think the discussion needs to be what could happen, going forward.
I agree with Tony on this one. Just to add on to it, I was instructed one time, a long time ago, as we were trying to introduce the whole concept of software security assurance in government, where we knew that the financial sector was doing it really, really well and paying attention to the software that they would put in production, but the US government was not doing it at all. And we brought some lawmakers together with some financial services folks and with some Department of Defense and civilian government folks, and they got into a room and they realized they weren't on the same page, that one entity was doing something really well and forward thinking, not that they were required to do it, and the other side was not. And I think what I learned in that is, as I was exploring it with the Department of Defense, one very senior executive that will go unnamed pointed me to, she said, you got a really good idea here. We should protect our software before we put it into production, because we have hundreds of thousands of applications that run the mission of government. However, you see those law books on my shelf? That's what I have to follow right there. And I don't have enough budget to do anything more than what's in those. So if you want to get ahead of something and do something more forward thinking, you have to create a law like the CCPA, the GDPR. I do see executives and even government is now paying attention to those activities that they'll either face some liability or they're able to get budget to fix, but not necessarily take on those things that are a good idea. And that's an area that I don't know how we address that, Tony. You're bringing it up in your boardroom meetings, but is that enough to cause the executives to apply a risk measurement to that area and to bring focus?
It's a crisis. I hate to say it, it usually takes a crisis.
And you don't want to waste those crises. But
Cynical but true.
this year, the OMB Cybersecurity Memo 20-04 points to previous efforts to simplify compliance with FISMA, because every year more things get added onto it that I have to go through, citing your law books, to make sure that I am meeting all the requirements under the law and under the federal guidance. Very rarely do people go back and clean up that, let's say, administrative debt.
That's right.
That has a list of things that I no longer need to be paying attention to as my primary objective. So because of the cyber sprint, now I'm at 98.5% two-factor authentication. So do I really need to be reporting two-factor authentication compliance every quarter? Probably not. There's something else that I should be spending my time doing. What is that? I've got maybe 20 different items that I think could go there, but I need to go back to the book to see what it is I need to report back.
Gotcha.
And nobody's ever going to be told they're doing it wrong if they do what they did last year.
Right.
And getting out of that mindset is difficult, and getting the law and practice to catch up is even more so.
So, in a little more tactical perspective, what can the folks that we work with every day, some of these customers, the folks out here in the audience, folks like myself, what do we need to do better to help you achieve that mission?
Well, reduce costs.
There
no.
you go. We all want ponies.
I have so many different platforms now that I need to care and feed for. That's part of my accidental architecture that grew up around all of my point solutions and have now evolved. So everyone does anti-X, everyone does DLP, everyone does encryption. I'd like to be able to pick and choose and not have to have the overhead of having the rest of that suite if I don't have to. Getting things into the cloud so that I can use them in the cloud, so that I'll be prepared when my data gets up there. Getting things to the point where it's easier for me to bring them in to my environment, because I know that there's either an interagency agreement, there's a FedRAMP authorization, there's some other risk process that's been gone through that I can point to instead of having to make my own out of whole cloth. These are all things that would help me. Is that going to help everyone in government? Possibly. I would say that while we're largely the same, we all have our own history of doing things a certain way. And I'm not going to say that anyone is wrong, but I know that I'm right.
Tony, in your experience, what would...
My advice would be invite your congressional staffers to lunch at one of your, and give them a tour of the stuff you run, that you operate. The biggest gap right now is knowledge at that level, and therefore with their bosses, the people who vote on appropriations and authorizations. I could name on one hand the number of people out of 535 in Congress who can speak tech, understand it, and you could have a reasonable conversation with. The rest are largely, they're not dumb, they're just not exposed. And it's probably the biggest single gap I see in terms of fixing this problem. So invite them to lunch, whatever committees of jurisdiction there are, if you're, no matter where you are, and start educating. And you know, make it right here in their face about where you're at. Without that changing, I don't know about much else that will ultimately be successful.
Yeah, just to kind of add to that, so at RSA last, I guess that was this year, sorry. Bruce Schneier was doing a chat, and he brought up this notion of, it was around cybersecurity and privacy, and sort of what can industry do, and how do we work with government to make sure that we don't stifle innovation as we try to tackle some of these issues. And yeah, he brought up this concept of a term I'd never heard before, but I thought it was brilliant. This notion of a public sector technologist, right? So sort of this liaison between the technical community and the lawmakers and policymakers. And I think to Tony's point, that's sorely needed, so they can have, you know, a better sense of what the risk really is, and not simply just looking in the rearview mirror. I mean, when you said risk, I was waiting for compliance to come up. I mean, those things pretty much always kind of go together, sadly. But it's difficult to imagine, you know, future architecture if you're not really considering what the risk is, but yet you have to be able to meet your compliance requirements, right? So by default, you're kind of forced to look in the rearview mirror, and that ultimately is hindering our progress.
So it's a buzzword. I'll give it that caveat, but it's also part of it, part of the defense strategy. Right? I think the big buzzword is IoT, and I'll put some boundaries around that for us, right? We talk about IoT, you know, it depends, they're things, right? And whatever you want to call that thing, they're becoming more and more prevalent, right? Whether they're integrated in people's homes, there's one in your pocket, you know, say, hey Siri, and how many phones answer, if I can mess with your phones for you. But I think in a lot of cases, what my experience has been, more on the commercial side, I'll be honest, like your feedback on it, is that a lot of these things are put in under the covers, or hey, it's somebody's pet project, they get put up and it does some stuff. Do you think there's a good plan for IoT as it relates to the federal government, or what are you guys doing around those spaces, or how are you preparing for the IoT?
I will just say that, and Tony and I had a short discussion on this before this session around the difference between the hardware components and the software components. Yep. And I'm primarily personally focused on software security, software assurance, and making sure that, you know, the software that you put into something is as clean and free of vulnerabilities as you can possibly make it at that moment in time, but that it has a secure update process so that adversaries cannot insert themselves in the middle of it. And my fear right now, and something that I constantly message, whether on Capitol Hill, there's a lot of work going on Capitol Hill with regard to IoT security at both the consumer level as well as the governmental level as to what types of devices and assurances are given to the consumption of these devices, assuring citizen privacy, but also ultimately it gets into national security. We're putting these devices into the infrastructure on, say, military bases that are controlling water and safety systems and so forth, that we have to make sure that these items come with not just the device and the software, but assured mechanisms and at least some minimum thresholds for securing them.
Yeah. If I could add on to that, so I mean, some of the work that Symantec has been doing, ongoing, frankly, is this notion of a nutritional label, right? So thinking about what it is that you stated about, whether it's hardware or software, what do we know about this vendor? Is the device upgradable? What operating system is it running? What revision is it, and so forth. So at least, again, trying to get some insight into what it is that you're attaching to your fabric would go a long way in helping us, manage that risk.
John?
So IoT and Zero Trust kind of go hand in hand as far as I'm concerned. We've had a lot of discussions, some of them very animated, some of them quite boring over the years, about what really is an IT project. Is controlling the heating of the building an IT project, or is it a building management system? And we've grown closer over the years with our partners throughout our agency and across other agencies to say, well, we need to treat it as it is. It's a sensor. It's something that is data collection. It's data analysis. And what can we do with that data? So we've brought a lot of folks around to think that, yes, these are things that we really need to manage as part of our overall risk assessment process, and maybe even as part of our technical infrastructure, our technology infrastructure and architecture. It's not going to go away. It is not going to get less intrusive. Right. And as we move into 5G technology, we're going to be more hyper-converged and hyper-communicating than ever before. So we better start addressing it now. So at least we have a policy and a framework. It won't be perfect for what's in the future, but at least it will be forward-looking rather than how did I deal with camera phones 20 years ago.
Right.
So I think, thanks for giving me time to think. I see a pattern developing here. I think one of the critical things we have to really think about is strong identity for machines. And this is software, hardware, IoT devices, industrial control technology, whatever it happens to be. You need a system of strong identity so that you can determine authoritatively that this thing is what it's representing itself to be. And right now, the opportunity to spoof or fake your identity in the digital universe is pretty easy. You don't have to have a lot of smarts to figure out how to do this. And so until we have a system in place that enforces strong identity and allows us to manage that at scale, I think we're going to have lots of problems managing this. But it goes beyond identity. It's then also, once you know provenance, where something came from, and you can trust that as being true, then you also need the next layer, which is what level of trust should I put in that thing? Because even though I can see who you are, you might be a really bad guy or gal or whatever, and even though I can identify you, I'm going to go, based on that. Yep. Or maybe I'll have some moderate level of trust and say, hey, you're pretty new, you look like you're okay, but I'm going to engage digitally with you in a different way than some fully trusted, partner and so on. Again, this is part of a model or a framework that I think is going to have to mature over the next couple of years. So those are just some fundamentals, I think, of a new way of dealing with this problem that we call broadly IoT. But it's changing everything. And we better figure it out pretty quick because it's the tidal wave that's coming at us.
There's a real parallel
real
to,
quick?
Yeah, please.
just real quick, there's
Yeah,
there's a real
and then you
parallel
both do.
between IoT and microservices. I mean, to Tony's point,
Right.
as far as what and who you're communicating with, software and hardware.
I'd just like to add, I mean, the imperative here for all of us is, we didn't discuss it up here, but if we look to the future and where we're going, all of you are things, right? You're all made out of software, and hackers and adversaries around the world are, while they're looking at these devices and the cameras that we're putting in our homes today, they're also looking at people and figuring out, how do we change the software in people? And that is a future that we need to be, I think, ahead of. I'm not as worried about a camera spying on me in my house than I am about somebody getting into my DNA and changing something inside of my own DNA. So the concepts that we're talking about here have some future ramifications that if we can't fix this and address it today, we are going to be way far behind when the stakes are much greater than they are today.
And now that Rob has scared the crap out of everybody.
It's my job.
Yeah. Well, it's all
You're
good.
not touching my DNA.
Yeah. And I'm going over here.
I am if you gave it to 23andMe.
So I think what we'd like to do is, and I know that we're wrapping up on time, but we're happy to take questions afterwards, about motorcycles especially. But I think we got Mr. Kish with the handy-dandy microphone. I give you the opportunity to, if there's questions out there, feel free to holler at somebody. If not, I'll either make somebody ask.
You
a
can go
question.
drink.
Right down here in front.
So Zero Trust is mentioned up there, and that's a buzzword, right?
Totally.
A lot of people are talking about Zero Trust. When I'm sitting in meetings, partners of ours, and even GuidePoint, we're talking about it. Defining it, understanding it, seems to be a challenge. Mm-hmm. For you guys, where does Zero Trust really end up going? Do people know what it is, and is it really going to help?
So I'll replay in case anybody didn't hear it. So the question shortly is, Zero Trust is a buzzword basically. What is it? How do you define it? Can you get there? Is that a fair restatement?
So
I have a lot of opinions, but I'm the moderator, so.
NIST just came out with their overall guidance on what Zero Trust is. It's out for public comment now. I'm hoping that's going to tell me a lot of it. I know what I think it should be. I know that it's not a product right now. I know it's sort of a framework that's evolving and emerging. And I know that there's a lot of squishiness around the language, that we're not all talking the same thing when we talk components of Zero Trust. But I'm looking forward to it, whatever it is, and I'm really looking forward to that public release of NIST, because I think then we'll all have at least a lexicon to rally around to start these conversations.
I think from what just my own personal opinion on it, if I can shift to this side of the house, Zero Trust is really hard from a implementation standpoint, right? Even if customers say, I like the idea of, we're going to have firewalls between all the segments and all these things, and zero, like I say, we're going to interact with it in a digital fashion. But to your point, I've got all this legacy architecture. All right, now you're going to go shove all this stuff in there. Number one, sysadmins are like, no, you're not. That's going to break my universe. I think probably it's more that getting over that hump with people. If you're going to change the entire world and I'm going to break stuff, it's a bitch to troubleshoot, candidly, when you have all those segmentations in there. So I think that's, from the practitioner side of the house, that's why,
Well, and what does that mean for cloud as well?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, how do you isolate that? What gets isolated? Who talks to who? Can you dynamically change those things? So there will be beer soon, and we will talk about that. So.
But
All good, man. No, all good.
just say real quick that
We got
if
one
you
back
haven't
here.
read the paper called from Google about Beyond Corp,
Yeah. Yep. That's a good one to start with.
that's
My
that's the
question
one.
is kind of cloud as it implicates security. I guess the premise, I think since OPM, since 2015, I think most federal agencies have a pretty good security stack that's geared primarily for legacy on-prem. But my hypothesis is that a lot of business owners are provisioning cloud infrastructure and unwittingly creating a weak link for the security posture overall. And I'm just curious if anybody on the panel feels that. It seems like we talk about the vulnerability of IoT knowingly, but that there are a lot of similar vulnerabilities for a lot of cloud infrastructure that seem to be getting passed by business owners. So the stack gets weakened.
My view is, and please, email me or comment to me on LinkedIn or whatever if you know of this, but I've not yet seen a single incident, a security breach occur because of an inherent flaw in the cloud infrastructure of either Google, Microsoft, or Amazon. There have been breaches, but it's all about what individual companies have implemented on top of their stack, right? So just like you can make mistakes in your own data center or whatever, it's a bad implementation on top of the Microsoft, Google, or Amazon stack.
I would say,
So, pardon me?
go ahead.
Well, so I think your risk, is implementing something in the cloud that you don't fully understand what you're doing, as opposed to putting the blame on Google, Amazon, or Microsoft. Now, they may be able to do a better job of telling you what the risks are or helping you through that, but I'm not at all worried about, or I'm less worried about their core infrastructure than I am about the stuff that we put on top of it.
These guys are dying.
I'll talk to you later.
Okay.
Specifically Amazon.
Okay.
I was like, these guys are twitching. I'm watching these guys twitch.
But that's
over here.
the insider thing,
Yeah.
right?
We've got
And
a question
okay.
over here, David, that we'll
Okay.
grab, or who's first. So, y'all fight it out. So,
I've got
All
the
right.
mic. I have the mic. So to Tony's point, so you're more concerned about what's being put on top. What's your position on open source software? I just read a 2019 Sonatype report that says there's 75% growth in the supply of open source component releases over the last 2 years, 71% increase in confirmed to suspected open source related breaches since 2014. Seems to me the growing percentage of the code that's being developed for the government is being built out of open source.
Yeah, so we put out the first open source policy, which encouraged it, but I think people have thought about this maybe in the wrong way. I'm not a fan of unmanaged open source, so if you were a client, I'm advising you, and you say, hey, we want to do open source, I'd say, great. Who are you paying to support it and make sure it's patched and updated and so on? In just the same way I would say you've got something from Oracle or Microsoft or whatever. If you just say we're going to do open source and nobody's going to manage it and really stay on top of it, then I think that's not wise. Same way as any other software. So, and that's a piece I think that sometimes people miss.
Does the government recognize that?
Yeah. We, at least the policy we put out said you should treat open source as any other kind of software, and that's with the requirement that you have a source of support for it.
I think we had one more over here, or she was first actually on this one, David. And we're over time, so y'all are free to go. You want to offend us, but we'll stay here and ask questions if you guys want.
Good afternoon, gentlemen. My name is Mary Dodson. I'm work on sourcing for Verizon Smart Communities, and so I'm deeply embedded in the the secure supply chain that we try to run, which we're really proud of. We don't have any Huawei in our system, and we're the only network that doesn't. But when you were talking earlier, you talked about trying to get things on a more flexible, fast method. The sprint that you talked about, which was so incredible, but at the same time, you're also talking about wanting more protections and more conservative efforts to control our sources of supply. How do you reconcile those things?
I could talk for 45 minutes, which I won't on this topic, but I think people have confused doing things quickly with doing them the right way. So one wise person said, hurry but don't rush, is kind of the way to think about it. And it bugs the hell out of me that I get 92 updates every day for things that are on my iPhone, and they all say bug fixes and features, and I can't find any features. It appears to be all bug fixes. And I wish they would just slow down and fix the bugs, every 3 months or whatever. It tells me they're not really doing good software development practices. Supply chain has the same set of issues we're talking about, rapid procurement and all the rest of it. And I think there's a happy ground somewhere in there where you follow good practices and you find a way to do it quicker than we're doing it today. But it can't be, a just wide open world where we take anything and then figure out later, if we have a problem. And that's true of software development, procurement, hiring. I mean, pick any topic. This rush to be quick and more agile comes with risk, and I think there's got to be a better balance. That's my view.
And I would add on to that, we talked about the cyber sprint. The cyber sprint wasn't necessarily to rush out and procure new equipment, new solutions.
10 years old at that time.
It was to fix and turn on best practices that should have been on, but were off for a number of inertial reasons. I think it was a way to empower IT and cybersecurity in the federal government to say, yes, mission is important, but let's slow down a little bit, take a breath, and do that mission properly and securely. So I'm not going to say supply chain is not important, it is, but when we're talking about the cyber sprint, that wasn't a piece of supply chain.
So I'd like the supplier's perspective on this one. Both of you are.
I think, Tony here, I think, had a sprint at Microsoft at one point. Microsoft had a great model. I think it was 2002, Bill Gates came out with the trustworthy computing memo. And it was for that organization then to put on the brakes and to look at how are we doing things and how are we managing the security of our software and our reputation and our brand out in the market. And every organization, NIST, I believe, has a set of supply chain best practices. What should we all be doing as we consume hardware and software in validating what we're getting, in checking with our vendors to find out, what are your processes for managing your own supply chain? And that's going into contracting. This year, I know in the Department of Defense, they've got the Cybersecurity Maturity Model certification that's being flowed out via contracts out to all of the vendors that supply into the Department of Defense. And we all have to up our game. And that means our own supply chain and our flow down to other vendors and where we source things from around the world, and just improving how we consume and how we validate all of the components that we use to build and deliver a service or a software or a product to our individual customers.
And for us, I would say, us adopting an RMF, specifically NIST's, certainly gone a long way to make our technology software more robust.
Awesome. We have one last question, and then we'll all go to the bar. You have the honor of the last question, sir.
Well, I appreciate that. Thank you very much. This is directed at Jonathan. And do you say your name Phoebus or Phoebus?
Phoebus.
Phoebus. Yeah. What is the Nuclear Regulatory Commission? I guess you're creating applications for your employees on the mobile devices directly just for those folks. And if you are, how are you ensuring that these applications are secure on mobile devices that are not inherently secure?
So containerization is the first and best answer for that. We also do code reviews and all the other best practices for developing secure and stable code, and then we containerize it. We actually have a fairly robust bring your own device program at the NRC. So we are following the information. We are able to tag it appropriately to make sure that we do different things for government furnished equipment as we do for personally owned devices. But we are very concerned about it ending up in the right place.
Awesome. Well, thank you guys. I appreciate it very much. We'll talk more motorcycles. Thank you guys. Thanks for sticking around with us.